This is an audio sample from the book Into the Orchard, the Midrashic Tradition in the New Testament, available at Amazon.com. In Jewish hermeneutics, there is a memorable acronym used to represent the four primary methods of approaching Scripture: PRDS. The acronym PARDS also forms the Hebrew word for orchard. It is from this word that we get the word paradise. As you might expect, paradise takes on many meanings in Jewish thought, from the plain sense to the esoteric. Again, the acronym represents four ways of looking at a given text: the plain meaning, the hinted, the homiletic, and the mystical. A yeshiva is a Jewish academy of learning whose name derives from the word for sitting. In a yeshiva, students will begin learning the plain meaning of Scripture at a very young age. It is essential to understand the simplest sense of the text before proceeding to higher levels. Unfortunately, today, it is not uncommon to find many unlearned students jumping into the highest levels of Torah study without having a proper understanding of the Peshat. I myself have been guilty of this. The result is not understanding a concept correctly and a need to backtrack and recalibrate. The rabbis, recognizing this trend some centuries ago, enacted a ban on the study of higher levels until a student had properly matriculated through each level. However, in the age of free information, no such ban could be easily enforced. Having already mentioned Remez in the beginning of this book, I'll briefly mention the last level, Sod. At one point, these mystical teachings were forbidden to students until they had reached the age of 40 and met specific criteria. These fences were intended in part to protect students from developing erroneous theologies and/or the very real dangers of washing out altogether. In some parts of Orthodox Judaism, this restriction is maintained. While there are various schools of thought on this matter, it is out of scope for this book. Suffice it to say, Judaism has maintained a process for understanding and transferring knowledge through the generations. Should one depart from this tradition or develop their own, the consequences might be devastating. This was the outcome of the 17th century with the Sabbatean movement, led by Shabbatai Tzvi, a false messiah who warped the mystical teachings to unholy outcomes. At the end of his movement, when faced with an ultimatum to convert to Islam or die, he chose to convert and took a lot of his followers with him. To this day, many Jews are skeptical of mysticism as a result. A new, old way of thinking. Regarding PARDS, it is important to recognize the manner in which a large portion of modern readers engage with Scripture is foreign to the ancient Semitic mind. The idea that a given verse of Scripture has a single correct meaning is problematic and limiting. As I stated above, the unvowelized form of the Hebrew naturally allows for various meanings. This is precisely how Scripture remains, as a living document, as some call it. It will become evident through this book that many of the verses in the New Testament play on the Hebrew words and leverage earlier Midrashic material in the same methods used by the Pharisees. At times, the New Testament presents material that requires knowledge of the deeper levels of Jewish hermeneutics to fully understand. It is fair to say that some of the original audiences, including the disciples, were unable to decipher some of Jesus' message. I find, in these cases, the average modern reader is even more unprepared to grasp these passages as naturally as a first-century Jewish listener would have been. Throughout this book, I encourage you to become comfortable with paradox and embrace the tension between the levels of meaning, allowing yourself to receive new insights and inspiration. Above all, let the Midrash challenge your previously held beliefs, as it has for many readers, for thousands of years. But is this really that important? As I have experienced at times, someone may ask, is learning this stuff really that important? The answer to that question is yours to discern. As we will see in this book, many times a reader can walk away with an erroneous understanding that is quite literally the opposite of what the author was trying to communicate. For many centuries, much of the world believed Jesus came to create a new religion, one that abandoned the Torah. In our time, we are beginning to understand how incorrect that assumption has been. When we remove that antinomian lens, we can see Yeshua's own words prevent one from arriving at that conclusion, yet here we are. Learning about the deeper cultural makeup of the Bible can be a rewarding endeavor. Of course, it requires work and a sense of adventure. For this reason, it is not surprising to me that many people stop learning about Scripture at a young age, never going further. They proceed with the understanding that they've learned all they need and miss the beauty and nuance that lies under the surface. Equally, if not more, problematic is the belief that all you need to know of Scripture can be ascertained from a plain reading of the text, sola scriptura, by Scripture alone, as some may call it. In this approach, institutional knowledge and cultural context are generally seen as less relevant or even off limits. Here, a reader's understanding of the various influences are only as deep as the reader's awareness of them. Perhaps the most dangerous, people unwittingly come to their own conclusions about the message, a reality that has been catastrophic for the church and the cause of thousands of denominations. For example, reading only on a plain level, a reader unaware of Egyptian mythology will not recognize that the plagues of Egypt are a systematic attack on many of Egypt's gods. A reader may also be unaware that the soon-to-be sacrificed lamb was symbolically connected to a particular Egyptian deity of whom it would have been sacrilegious to kill. Moses' protest in Exodus 8:22 indicates that he was well aware of the risk of such an act. A reader may not understand the book of Jonah that seems to leverage the Assyrian tradition of the Apkallu, ancient fish sages, who were believed to emerge from the Persian Gulf daily, teaching wisdom to the people of Assyria on all matters of life, religion, astrology, and civilization. Against this backdrop, the reader might recognize the beautifully ironic endorsement of Jonah's message by the giant fish who played a major part in his mission to Nineveh. Not understanding the peculiarities of Greco-Roman worship practices, which seem to have been a more quid pro quo relationship than the notion of grace found in the Torah, would miss the complexity and difficulty the apostles had in their attempts to integrate these different people groups into the diasporic synagogue communities. Lastly, what does Paul mean when he mentions the third heaven? Who were Yanes and Yameres? And what exactly are demons? And many more questions like these. One final word of caution. At this point, I feel it necessary to share a word of caution with the hope that you might avoid some of my early mistakes. A potential side effect of reading Midrashic material is that it might create a kind of dissonance or uneasiness in discerning fact from fiction. If this is your experience, I can relate. In truth, it took me nearly 9 months to fully understand where to place these stories in the mosaic that has become my worldview, and another few years to write this book. Another potentiality, new readers can often fall into the error of taking Midrash as literal, or possibly worse, taking nothing in the Bible at face value, assuming that nothing in Scripture means what it plainly says. You'll find many times in Jewish literature, a situation is written in a way to teach a valuable lesson, but should not always be taken as literal, historical fact. Admittedly, it is not always simple to know when this is the case. I recommend that one must develop a healthy sense of balance and hold loosely to what we think we know. Many of these rabbinic writings and concepts are creative masterpieces, cultivated over many generations, locations, and circumstances. Their messages remain useful in developing modern spiritual growth and deriving important lessons from the Torah. Yet, they are not to be a replacement for the literal meaning of the words of Scripture. It doesn't work for a reader to opt for a particular midrashic understanding as a means of sidestepping a difficult passage. There are no shortcuts for these, I'm afraid. The more you become familiar with the Midrash, the more attuned you will become to understanding their place and value. The people of the book. Judaism has always placed a high value on education, and still so today. Long before writing became commonplace, memorization was the chief method applied from the earliest ages. Writing about the Jewish children he encountered in Israel, the church father Jerome says, In childhood, they acquire the complete vocabulary of their language and learn to recite all the generations from Adam to Zerubbabel with such accuracy and facility as if they were simply giving their names. Epistle to Titus Jerome. By the age of 10 years old, traditional first-century Jewish children would have memorized the entire Tanakh, which is an acronym for the Torah, first 5 books, Nebi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings. It follows that once these students had sufficiently mastered the Peshat, the majority of their continued learning would advance them further into the deeper levels of understanding. But as for you, stand here at Sinai with me, and I shall speak to you the entire commandment and the decrees and the ordinances that you shall teach them, and they shall perform in the land that you shall possess. Deuteronomy 5:28. It might seem that memorization is not a reliable method of carrying information, but it has been studied that many ancient people groups, particularly nomadic, had developed an incredible capacity for memorization. These skills are cultivated through repetition and storytelling. Through these methods, the words of Torah would be taught and passed from generation to generation with perfect precision until the technology of writing became practical and affordable. There is good reason to believe that it was the oral tradition that kept and preserved the written. The Jewish people have been known as the people of the book, but from the earliest times through memorization and storytelling, I posit that the people were the book. This is an audio sample from the book, Into the Orchard, the Midrashic Tradition in the New Testament, available at Amazon.com.